Hey friends, I recently noticed that almost 80% of viewers who enjoyed our videos watch our videos haven't subscribed yet. If you like the stories and you want to see more, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It really helps our channel to grow. Don't forget to like and leave a comment below. Your engagement makes a huge difference and help this stories reach more people. Where are you watching from? They whispered he was cursed to die alone, but the woman who knocked on his castle door during the storm would shatter 40 years of isolation. The October wind howled like a wounded beast across the North Dakota plains, driving sheets of icy rain against the towering stone walls of Ravenscroft Castle. Perched on windswept cliffs overlooking the wild territory below, the fortress stood dark and forbidding against the violent autumn sky, its turrets disappearing into storm clouds that churned with unnatural fury. Inside the vast library, Duke Alexander Thornheart stood at the tall arched window, one hand pressed against the cold glass, watching the tempest rage across his estate with the same detached melancholy that had defined his 40 years of existence. Silver threads gleamed in his dark hair, catching the firelight from the hearth behind him. His piercing grey eyes, once described by his late mother as beautiful, now carried only the weight of profound loneliness, lines etched deep around them like cracks in aged marble. He was known throughout the Fargo-Moorhead territory as the untouchable Duke, a man of immense wealth and power who had never been seen with a woman, never attended social gatherings, and had not once stepped foot beyond his castle gates in nearly 20 years. The servants whispered among themselves that he was cursed, that some dark secret kept him locked away from the world. The townspeople in the settlement below were more blunt. They simply called him mad. Perhaps they were right, Alexander thought, turning from the window to face the empty room. The library that had once hosted his parents' literary salons now stood silent, except for the crackling fire and the storm's fury. Isolation is safety, he reminded himself, a mantra worn smooth by decades of repetition. Distance is protection. Remaining untouched means remaining unbroken. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Gerard, his elderly butler, entered carrying a silver tray with the Duke's evening meal. The man had served the Thornheart family for 45 years and was one of only 7 staff members who remained in the castle, the only souls Alexander allowed near him. "Your supper, Your Grace," Gerard said softly, setting the tray on the massive desk that dominated one corner of the library. "You should eat while it's warm." Alexander barely glanced at the food. "Thank you, Gerard. That will be all." The butler hesitated, something he rarely did. "Your Grace, the storm is worsening. The worst we've seen in 20 years, perhaps more. The roads will be completely impassable by midnight." "Then it's fortunate I have no intention of traveling," Alexander replied, his attention already returning to the leather-bound medical text he'd been studying. "Epilepsy, its causes and manifestations," the spine read in faded gold lettering. Gerard withdrew quietly, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Alexander listened to the silence that followed, the oppressive, suffocating silence that had been his only companion for 2 decades. He had convinced himself he preferred it this way. People were dangerous. Connection was pain. Better to remain alone in his fortress, managing his vast estate through intermediaries and correspondence, never risking the vulnerability that came with human contact. His daily routine had become a ritual of avoidance. Morning. Gerard brought breakfast to the library, and Alexander barely acknowledged his presence. Afternoon. He reviewed estate ledgers alone in his study, making decisions about lands and lives he never directly witnessed. Evening. He read ancient medical texts by candlelight, searching for answers to questions he'd stopped asking aloud. Night. He lay awake in the master chambers, listening to the emptiness of the castle, to the ghost of laughter that once filled these halls before the fire that took his parents 20 years ago. The clock in the corner struck 11, its chimes echoing through the cavernous room. Alexander rubbed his tired eyes and forced himself to look at the cold supper Gerard had brought. He should eat, he should sleep, he should do many things that normal people did. But he was not normal. He was broken, cursed. The storm intensified, thunder rolling across the plains like artillery fire. Rain lashed the windows with renewed violence, and somewhere in the castle, shutters banged loose. Alexander barely registered it. He'd weathered countless storms within these walls, and they all felt the same nature's fury, a mere echo of the tempest that raged perpetually in his own mind. He turned the page of his medical text, squinting at the cramped handwriting in the margins. Some previous reader had annotated extensively, noting observations about seizure patterns and triggers. Alexander had read this passage 100 times, always hoping to find some detail he'd missed, some key to understanding the condition that had defined and destroyed his life. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm. 11:30. The fire burned lower. The storm showed no signs of abating. Then, at precisely midnight, 3 sharp knocks echoed through the great hall below, desperate, urgent, demanding. Alexander's head snapped up, his heart suddenly racing. In 20 years, no one had knocked on his door unannounced. No one came to Ravenscroft Castle unless summoned. He stood frozen, the medical text forgotten in his hands, listening. The knocks came again, louder this time, more insistent. He heard Gerard's shuffling footsteps, heard the ancient butler making his way to the entrance. Alexander found himself moving toward the library door, drawn by a curiosity he couldn't name, his hands already beginning to tremble with something that felt almost like anticipation. "Your Grace," Gerard's voice carried up the stone staircase, urgent and alarmed. "Your Grace," quickly. Alexander emerged onto the landing overlooking the great hall just as Gerard pulled open the massive front door. Wind and rain exploded into the entrance, extinguishing half the candles in their sconces. And there, collapsed on the threshold like a broken bird, was a woman. She was drenched to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her face, a cut above her eye bleeding freely down her pale cheek. Her simple governess's dress clung to her shaking frame, and even from where he stood, Alexander could see she was trembling violently, whether from cold, fear, or injury. He couldn't tell. For the first time in 20 years, Alexander Thornhart found himself in the presence of a woman. His breath caught in his throat. His hands, already trembling, began to shake harder. The overwhelming sensation of potential human contact, real, immediate, unavoidable, crashed over him like a physical wave. Gerard looked up at him, eyes pleading for direction. The storm howled through the open door. The woman stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping her lips. Alexander gripped the banister, fighting the urge to flee back to his library, to his safe isolation. But something in that desperate knock, something in the way she lay there utterly vulnerable and broken, called to a part of him he'd thought long dead. "Bring her inside," he whispered, his voice rusty from disuse, barely audible over the storm's fury. Then, louder, forcing the words past decades of self-imposed silence, "Quickly, before the storm takes us all." "Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Gerard moved with surprising speed for his age, and together they carried the unconscious woman through the shadowed corridors of Ravenscroft Castle. Alexander's heart hammered against his ribs as his hands supported her shoulders, feeling the fragile bones beneath the soaked fabric, the alarming chill of her skin. 20 years since he'd touched another human being beyond the most cursory contact, and now this intimacy of carrying a dying stranger through his home. His hands shook so violently he feared he might drop her. They reached the guest quarters in the East Wing, a suite of rooms that hadn't been opened in 15 years. Dust motes swirled in the candlelight as Gerard shouldered open the door. The 4-poster bed dominated the space, its coverings musty but still intact. They laid her carefully on the aged linens, and Alexander immediately stepped back, pressing himself against the far wall as if distance might restore his equilibrium. "I'll fetch medical supplies, Your Grace," Gerard said, already moving toward the door. "The kit from the dispensary." "Quickly," Alexander managed, his voice barely his own. Then he was alone with her, this stranger who had shattered his carefully ordered existence with 3 desperate knocks. He forced himself to approach the bed, fighting the panic that clawed at his throat. "She needs help," he told himself. "She's injured. You know basic medical care from all those books." But books were different from flesh and blood. His fingers trembled as he gently brushed the wet hair from the wound above her eye. The contact sent something like electricity through him, not desire exactly, but something equally profound. Connection. The simple, terrifying reality of another human being beneath his touch. Memories flooded him unbidden. His mother's hand in his as she took her last breath, her skin already cooling. 20 years ago, in this very castle, the last time he'd allowed himself to truly touch another soul. The woman stirred, a soft groan escaping her lips. Alexander froze as her eyes fluttered open, brown, fierce, intelligent, despite the exhaustion that clouded them. Confusion crossed her face first, then fear, then something that looked almost like determination. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw from the cold and rain. "Please, don't send me back. You're safe." Alexander heard himself say, the words formal and stiff. "I am Alexander Thornhart, Duke of this estate. You're in Ravenscroft Castle. No one will send you anywhere." Her eyes searched his face, weighing the truth of his words. "Ceres," she finally said. "Ceres Nixon." Gerard returned with the medical kit, and together they tended her wounds while she drifted in and out of consciousness. She was a governess from the Peacock estate, she told them in fragments, falsely accused of something she wouldn't name, thrown out into the storm with nowhere to go. No family, no prospects, just the desperate hope that someone, anyone, would offer shelter until the tempest passed. "You may stay," Alexander told her, already backing toward the door, "as long as necessary." He fled before she could respond. Back in his library, Alexander paced like a caged animal. 20 years of carefully constructed walls, and this woman had breached them in a single night. His hands still trembled with the memory of her hair beneath his fingers. Her desperate whisper, "Don't send me back." "Your tea, Your Grace," Gerard said, appearing with his uncanny timing. Alexander took the cup without tasting it. "She'll leave when the storm passes." "Of course, Your Grace." Gerard's knowing look said otherwise. "Though she needs help, and perhaps you do too. That will be all, Gerard." But the words lingered long after the butler departed, echoing in the empty library like an accusation. At 2 in the morning, Alexander found himself standing outside the guest quarters, unable to sleep, unable to stay away. Through the partially open door, he could see Ceres lying awake, staring at the ceiling with those fierce brown eyes. "Can't sleep either?" he asked from the doorway, unwilling to cross the threshold. She turned her head toward him. "I keep thinking I'll wake up back in the storm." "You're safe here," he repeated, then added something he hadn't planned to say. "It's been very quiet here, for a very long time." A crack in his armor, small but unmistakable. "Thank you," she said softly, "for opening your door." He nodded and retreated before the conversation could go deeper. The next morning, Gerard brought news that made Alexander's stomach clench. "The storm will last 3 more days at minimum, Your Grace. The roads are completely impassable. Miss Nixon will need to remain here." 3 days. 3 days of this stranger in his castle, disrupting his isolation, making him feel things he'd sworn never to feel again. Terror warred with something else in his chest, something dangerous, something that felt almost like hope. Alone again in the guest quarters, Ceres studied the portrait on the wall, a young couple, elegant and happy, their eyes full of life. The resemblance between the man in the painting and her mysterious host was unmistakable. These were his parents, she realized, and something terrible had happened to them. Thunder crashed outside, shaking the ancient stones. Her candle flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. "What secrets are you hiding, Duke Thornhart?" she whispered to the shadows. The storm was only beginning. Morning light filtered weakly through the storm clouds as Gerard knocked on Alexander's study door. "Your Grace, I've set breakfast in the dining room. For 2. "I'll take mine here," Alexander said without looking up from his ledgers. "With respect, Your Grace, Miss Nixon is a guest. It would be inappropriate to let her dine alone." Alexander's jaw tightened, but he knew Gerard was right. 15 minutes later, he found himself seated at one end of the impossibly long dining table, while Ceres sat at the other, a vast expanse of polished mahogany between them. The silence was excruciating, broken only by the clink of cutlery against china. "The storm seems to be easing slightly," Ceres ventured. "Yes. The castle architecture is remarkable." "How old?" 1853. Another painful silence. Ceres tried twice more, receiving only monosyllabic responses. Finally, Alexander stood abruptly. "Excuse me, estate business requires my attention." He fled to his study like a man pursued. "He means well, miss," Gerard said gently as he cleared the breakfast dishes. "Would you like to see more of the castle? His Grace won't mind." The tour revealed a palace of ghosts. The library held thousands of volumes, many on medicine and anatomy, far more than a typical nobleman would collect. The conservatory stood abandoned, its plants long dead, a dust-covered piano silent in the corner. In the portrait gallery, Ceres stopped before a painting of a young Alexander, perhaps 18, standing between his parents. The boy in the painting had laughter in his eyes. "He wasn't always like this, miss," Gerard said quietly. Something changed him. That evening, Ceres carried a dinner tray to Alexander's study, knocking firmly. "I wanted to thank you properly for your hospitality, Your Grace." He looked up, startled, as she set the tray on his desk beside towers of medical texts. Her eyes caught the titles: Modern Theories of Neurological Disease, Advances in Seizure Treatment. "You're interested in medicine?" she asked. Yes, somewhat." His voice was guarded. "I studied for 2 years in Chicago," Ceres said, settling into the chair across from him. "Under Dr. Morrison. He was pioneering work in neurological conditions." For the first time, Alexander truly looked at her. "Morrison? I've read his papers on—" He caught himself, but it was too late. The dam had cracked. They talked for 20 minutes about emerging medical theories, about the revolution in understanding the human brain. Alexander's whole demeanor changed, animated, intelligent, engaged. Then suddenly he stood, as if realizing he'd revealed too much. "Good night, Miss Nixon." But Ceres had seen the truth. He wasn't mad or cruel. He was terrified of connection itself. Day 2 brought a delicate dance. Alexander tried to maintain his isolation, but Ceres seemed to materialize wherever he went, in the library at dawn. In the corridor discussing estate management questions so insightful, he found himself explaining his agricultural innovations before catching himself mid-sentence. Evening found him drawn by music to the conservatory. Ceres sat at the piano, playing Chopin with surprising skill. The notes filled the dead space with life, and Alexander stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to flee. She saw him, smiled, kept playing, and he didn't run away. At 3 in the morning, Ceres wandered restlessly to the library and found Alexander surrounded by a fortress of medical texts, candles burning low, his face drawn with distress. He looked up, startled, and tried to hide what he was reading. Books cascaded to the floor. Epilepsy, causes and manifestations, hereditary madness, seizure disorders. Understanding dawned in Ceres's eyes. "You have epilepsy," she said gently, not a question. The wall Alexander had built over 20 years crumbled in an instant. The words poured out his diagnosis at 15, seizures worsening after his parents' death, his uncle's insistence that it was hereditary madness. He said I'd harm anyone close to me, that I must never marry, never have children. That isolation was the only safe choice for everyone. 20 years. 20 years of believing he was cursed. "Your uncle lied to you," Ceres said firmly. She retrieved her own notebook from her room, water-damaged but intact, filled with notes from her Chicago studies. "Epilepsy is neurological, not demonic, not madness. It's manageable with proper treatment, but the seizures are a medical condition. Nothing more." Alexander broke then. 20 years of grief, shame, and isolation crashed over him. He wept as he hadn't since his mother's death, and when Ceres instinctively reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. They sat together until dawn, talking. Day 3's breakfast found them at the same end of the table, silence comfortable now instead of painful. Alexander asked about her life, truly asked, truly listened. She told him of being orphaned at 12, raised by an aunt who saw her as a burden, of teaching herself from borrowed books, of 2 precious years studying medicine before poverty forced her into governess work. "You should have been a doctor," Alexander said. "Women can't be doctors," Ceres replied simply. "They should be." By afternoon, the storm was breaking. Weak sunlight pierced the clouds. They stood at the library window, watching the weather clear, and both felt the weight of ending. "Perhaps you could stay another day," Alexander said, the words coming with visible effort, "to ensure the roads are truly safe." "I'd like that," Ceres said, "very much." Then, distant but unmistakable, hoofbeats, many horses. Gerard burst through the door, face pale. "Your Grace, Nicholas Peacock has arrived with armed men. He's demanding entrance." Alexander's face went white. "My uncle, he's here." Alexander and Ceres reached the main entrance just as Gerard pulled open the heavy doors. A man in his 60s sat astride a black stallion, surrounded by 6 rough-looking hired men. Nicholas Peacock radiated entitlement in his expensive tailored coat and polished boots, his cold grey eyes so like Alexander's, yet utterly devoid of warmth, surveying the castle as if he already owned it. "Alexander," Nicholas said, not bothering with titles or courtesy, I've come for the thief you're harboring. Hand over Miss Nixon immediately. Uncle Nicholas. Alexander's voice was steady, though Ceres felt him trembling beside her. Miss Nixon is my guest. She stays. Nicholas's eyes widened fractionally, the only sign of his shock. In 20 years, Alexander had never contradicted him. Have you gone completely mad, boy? This woman stole from my estate, seduced my son, and— That's a lie, Ceres said clearly. She stepped forward, chin raised despite her fear. Your son, Richard, attempted to assault one of your housemaids. When I intervened and threatened to report him, your wife accused me instead and threw me out into the storm. Lies from a scheming woman's mouth, Nicholas spat. Alexander, you're clearly unwell. Let me handle this. She stays. Alexander's voice was firmer now. This is my castle, and she is my guest. For the first time in 2 decades, Alexander Thornhart had defied his uncle. Nicholas dismounted, his composure cracking. This woman has bewitched you. Can't you see? Ceres had gone pale, staring at Nicholas with sudden recognition. Her hand dove into her satchel, pulling out water-damaged documents. You're Alexander's uncle. You're the estate manager from these ledgers. She thrust the papers at Alexander. His hands shook as he scanned page after page of meticulous financial records, 20 years of systematic embezzlement, funds siphoned from Thornhart properties into Peacock accounts. You've been stealing from me, Alexander whispered. All this time. Those are forgeries, Nicholas snarled, but his face had gone red with rage. Alexander, you're ill. You need me to manage things properly. I was going to have you declared incompetent for your own good. Someone needs to be your guardian. You're mad. You have seizures. You can't marry or produce heirs. You needed me isolated, Alexander said, pieces falling into place. Unmarried, without children, so eventually everything would pass to you. Your parents would have discovered my adjustments to the accounts, Nicholas said, his control finally breaking. I couldn't allow. Silence fell like an executioner's blade. What did you say about my parents? Alexander's voice was deadly quiet. Nicholas realized his mistake, tried to backtrack, but it was too late. Nothing. I merely meant the fire. Alexander's face had gone white. You set the fire. They were going to ruin everything, Nicholas roared. Audit the books, destroy my plans. I had no choice. The stress shattered Alexander's fragile control. He staggered, eyes rolling back, and collapsed. His body convulsed on the stone floor. The seizure, violent and unmistakable. Ceres dropped to her knees beside him instantly, medical training taking over. She turned him on his side, protected his head, her movements calm and professional even as her heart raced. Nicholas's hired men looked horrified, taking unconscious steps backward. You see? Nicholas sneered triumphantly. Mad, cursed, completely unfit to hold any title. Gerard, Ceres said without looking up, her hands steady on Alexander's shaking body. Fetch the sheriff. Now. This is epilepsy, not madness, she said to Nicholas, her voice cutting through the courtyard. And I have proof you've been poisoning him. She pulled out household account records she'd found during her explorations. Regular mercury purchases. For 15 years. Mercury poisoning worsens seizures, causes symptoms of madness. The medical texts in his library have all the signs underlined because he was documenting what was being done to him. Alexander's seizure subsided. He lay gasping, weak but conscious, hearing every word. Hoofbeats announced the sheriff's arrival. Gerard had sent for him at dawn, his old servant's instinct sensing trouble. The evidence was overwhelming. Embezzlement records, witnessed murder, confession, poisoning documentation. Nicholas tried to flee. His hired men abandoned him immediately, unwilling to hang for another man's crimes. The sheriff's deputies seized him as he scrambled for his horse. You'll never survive without me, boy, Nicholas screamed as they dragged him away. You're too broken, too mad. You need me. Alexander, supported by Ceres, met his uncle's eyes. No, I needed the truth, and I finally have it. Evening found them in the library, the castle eerily quiet after the day's chaos. Nicholas's hired men had confessed everything, 15 years of calculated poisoning, designed to worsen Alexander's condition and make him appear incompetent. 20 years, Alexander said, staring at his hands. 20 years of lies. Ceres took those hands in hers. But you're free now, free to live whatever life you choose. Long silence stretched between them, filled with possibility. And what if I choose this? Alexander said finally. You, here, helping me rebuild? He stood, pulling her up with him. Ceres Nixon, I know I'm broken, I know I'm cursed. You're neither, she interrupted fiercely. Would you consider staying? Not as a guest, not as a governess, but as my wife? Thunder rumbled in the distance, another storm approaching. But this time, Alexander wasn't alone to face it. Yes, Ceres whispered. Yes, I'll stay. News of the engagement exploded through Fargo-Moorhead territory like a powder keg. The untouchable Duke, 40 years old, isolated for 2 decades, never seen with a woman, was marrying a penniless governess. No courtship, no engagement period. An immediate wedding. In the general store, Margaret Cooper's voice dripped with false sweetness. She must have bewitched him. What else could explain it? Seduced a madman for his fortune, Ida Patterson agreed, needle flashing through her embroidery. Mark my words, she'll be the ruin of him. But elderly Mr. Whitmore, who remembered young Alexander before the tragedy, shook his head. Perhaps she's his salvation. At the Peacock estate, chaos reigned. Nicholas sat in a territorial prison cell awaiting trial for murder and embezzlement. Richard Peacock, his son, now understood the full scope of his father's corruption, every coin of their wealth stolen from the Thornharts. The estate would be seized. Everything lost. In a shadowy corner of the settlement tavern, Richard met with men of questionable character. I need witnesses, he said, sliding coins across the table. People willing to testify that the Duke is incompetent, dangerous, that this marriage is a fraud. At Ravenscroft Castle, preparations proceeded with quiet intensity. Alexander insisted on a small ceremony, only Gerard, the castle staff, and the sheriff as witnesses. I don't need society's approval, he told Ceres. I need you. Gerard opened the castle stores and produced a dress preserved in lavender silk, the color of moonlight, belonging to Alexander's mother. Ceres traced the delicate embroidery with trembling fingers. She would have loved you, miss, Gerard said, his voice thick with emotion. The night before the wedding, Alexander found himself in Gerard's quarters, pacing like a caged animal. What if I have a seizure during the ceremony? The words tumbled out. What if she realizes what she's agreeing to and runs? Gerard, I don't know how to be a husband. The old butler placed a steady hand on Alexander's shoulder. You know how to be kind, Your Grace. Start there. Dawn light streamed through the stained glass windows of the castle chapel as Alexander stood at the altar in his father's wedding suit. His hands trembled violently as Ceres appeared in the doorway, ethereal in his mother's dress. A traveling preacher performed the ceremony, his voice echoing in the intimate space. When it came time for vows, Alexander's voice shook but held firm. I promise to trust you, to let you in, to try, to be worthy of this gift you're giving me. Ceres's response was steady as stone. I promise to stand with you, through storms and seizures, through all of it. You may kiss your bride. Alexander hesitated, leaning close. I've never, he whispered. Ceres smiled gently. Then we'll learn together. Their first kiss was chaste, tender, and absolutely perfect. Gerard wept openly, not bothering to hide his tears. Wedding breakfast was served in the morning room, intimate and warm. Alexander couldn't stop staring at the gold band on his finger, turning it with his thumb as if to confirm its reality. Ceres noticed, took his hand in hers. This is real, she assured him. He smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile in 20 years. I know. I just keep expecting to wake up. By afternoon, news reached the settlement. The reaction was swift and brutal. Society ladies clutched their pearls and whispered of scandal. Merchants speculated about the Duke's mental state, but a few, those who remembered the bright young man before tragedy struck, allowed themselves to hope. That evening, in the master chambers Alexander hadn't occupied in years, fear and intimacy overwhelmed him in equal measure. We don't have to. I can sleep elsewhere if... He started. Alexander. Ceres's voice was firm but kind. I married you. All of you. We'll take everything at your pace. They lay together in the massive bed, talking until dawn painted the sky gold. Alexander fell asleep holding her hand, experiencing the first peaceful sleep he'd had in 2 decades. He woke in a panic, certain it had been a dream. Then he saw Ceres beside him, her dark hair spread across the pillow, and peace returned. Gerard's knock came with breakfast. Your Grace, Duchess, the staff wishes to congratulate you properly. The castle servants had gathered in the great hall, genuine joy lighting their faces. Many had watched Alexander suffer for 20 years, helpless to ease his pain. Now, seeing him with his bride, hope blossomed where despair had reigned. The joy was short-lived. By afternoon, a letter arrived bearing the territorial governor's seal. Nicholas Peacock's lawyer had filed a formal complaint, claiming Alexander was mentally incompetent and the marriage should be annulled. A hearing was scheduled in 6 months. Alexander's face went white as he read the document. They're going to take this away. Take you away. Then we have 6 months to prove them wrong. Ceres's voice was steel, wrapped in silk. She spread the legal documents across the study desk, already formulating strategy. We need medical experts to evaluate you, public appearances to demonstrate your competence, witnesses to counter their narrative. You're asking me to face society, Alexander said, panic creeping into his voice. I can't. You can. Ceres took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Because you're not facing them alone. He looked at her, his wife, his partner, his salvation, and found courage he didn't know he possessed. Then let's show them who we really are. Morning sunlight streamed through the study windows as Ceres spread documents across Alexander's desk with military precision. We need 3 things, she said, tapping each stack of papers. Medical experts to evaluate you, public appearances to demonstrate your competence, and witnesses who'll testify to your character. Alexander stared at the organized chaos, overwhelmed. How do we possibly, one step at a time? Her confidence was unshakable. Trust me? He nodded, because what else could he do? She was his wife, his advocate, his only hope. By afternoon, Ceres had written 6 letters to Dr. Morrison in Chicago, to colleagues from her medical studies, to specialists who'd published papers on epilepsy. Her network astounded Alexander. You're extraordinary, he said, watching her seal the final envelope. She smiled, dipping her pen in ink for another letter. I'm pragmatic. There's a difference. The estate tour was Alexander's idea, though terror seized him the moment the carriage rolled through the castle gates. 15 years since he'd visited his own tenant farms. 15 years of managing through intermediaries, of hiding behind correspondence and ledgers. I can't do this, he whispered as the first farmhouse came into view. Ceres squeezed his hand. Yes, you can. The farmer's shock was palpable when the Duke himself stepped from the carriage. Many had never seen him, this near mythical figure who owned their land but never appeared. Wariness marked their faces, but Ceres's warm greeting melted the initial frost. Mr. Henderson, isn't it? Alexander said, consulting mental notes from his ledgers. Your wheat yield was exceptional last season. And your daughter, she recovered from the fever? The farmer blinked, astonished the Duke knew such details. Aye, your grace. Mary's quite well now. By the 4th farm, Alexander had begun to relax. He was awkward, certainly, but his genuine interest in their lives showed through. Then stress triggered what he'd feared most. The aura came first, that strange metallic taste, the visual distortions. Ceres, he managed, and then the world went sideways. He fell from the carriage, convulsing on the dirt road. Farmers shouted in alarm, children screamed, but Ceres was already there, calm as still water, turning him on his side, protecting his head. This is epilepsy, she announced clearly, her voice carrying authority. It's a medical condition, not madness. He'll recover in moments. Please, give him space. She demonstrated proper care with such professional competence that fear transformed into fascination. When Alexander came back to himself, mortified and weak, he found farmers watching with concern rather than horror. Took courage to come out here, your grace, old Henderson said quietly. Knowing this might happen. That's leadership, that is. Word spread through the estate with astonishing speed. The Duke wasn't mad, he was ill. There was a difference. And the Duchess knew medicine, took care of him with skill and devotion. Perhaps this marriage made sense after all. That evening, Alexander sat in their chambers, head in his hands. They saw me at my weakest. They saw you being human. Ceres knelt before him, taking his face in her hands. That's not weakness, Alexander. That's courage. 20 years of shame poured out, then decades of believing himself cursed, unfit, monstrous. She held him through it all, this woman who'd become his salvation. Your condition doesn't define you, she whispered. Your character does. Dr. Morrison's reply arrived within the week. He would come, bringing 2 specialist colleagues, but arrangements would take 3 months. With the hearing in 6 months, they were cutting it dangerously close. Then we use these 3 months wisely, Ceres said, undaunted. She outlined a social rehabilitation plan, weekly settlement visits, small gatherings at the castle to rebuild Alexander's atrophied social skills. "I don't know how to be around people," Alexander protested. "Neither did I," she smiled. "We'll learn together." 2 weeks into their marriage, Alexander and Ceres entered the Fargo Moorhead General Store. The effect was instantaneous. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward them. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Alexander froze, every instinct screaming to flee. But Ceres took his arm firmly, smiled warmly at the storekeeper. "Good afternoon, Mr. Patterson. What lovely fabric you've received. We're planning some castle improvements and we'll need supplies. We'll be hiring local workers, of course." Money spoke louder than gossip. Curiosity began overtaking hostility as Ceres chatted naturally, drawing Alexander into conversation about estate renovations. He managed halting responses, but he was there, present, trying. Then Margaret Cooper approached, all false sweetness. "How did you trap him, Miss Nixon? Or should I say, Duchess?" The barb hung in the air. Ceres met Margaret's gaze without flinching. "I didn't trap anyone. Alexander chose me." "Yes," Alexander said, finding his voice with sudden clarity. "I did, and I'm grateful every day." Margaret's composure cracked. Other townspeople, overhearing, exchanged glances. Perhaps there was genuine affection here after all. "I did it," Alexander said in the carriage, exhilarated despite exhaustion. "I actually went to town." "You did." Ceres's pride shone in her eyes. "And we'll do it again." He kissed her then, spontaneous and less hesitant than their wedding kiss. Both were surprised by the growing comfort between them, the intimacy building in small increments. That night, talking in their chamber, Alexander asked about her past, truly asked, truly listened. Ceres shared painful memories, orphaned at 12, raised by an aunt who saw her as burden, teaching herself from borrowed books, 2 precious years studying medicine before poverty forced her into servitude. "We're both survivors," Alexander observed. "Yes, but now we're thriving," Ceres responded, threading her fingers through his. A late knock shattered the peace. Gerard appeared with a young woman barely 18, terrified, bruised. The maid from Peacock Estate, the one Richard had assaulted. "He's threatening me," she sobbed. "Says if I testify against his father, he'll—" I had nowhere else to go. "You have somewhere now," Ceres said immediately. "You'll stay here. You're safe." Alexander agreed, without hesitation. "We'll protect you." Later, as they settled the girl in guest quarters, a realization crystallized between them. "There are others like her," Ceres said. "Like I was, desperate, with nowhere to go." Alexander looked around the massive, empty castle, this fortress that had been his prison. What if we became that place? That haven? A vision formed. Not isolation, but sanctuary. Not fortress, but refuge. "Let's build something bigger than us," Ceres said. Alexander pulled her close. Together, 3 months transformed Ravenscroft from a tomb into a living, breathing sanctuary. The East Wing, long shuttered, now housed staff quarters filled with women who'd fled desperate circumstances, former Peacock employees, widows with nowhere else to turn, young girls escaping abusive households. The castle that had imprisoned one man now sheltered dozens. Alexander walked the corridors at dawn, still adjusting to voices echoing where silence once reigned. But when a young maid smiled shyly at him in passing, he found himself smiling back. Progress, small but real. Dr. Morrison arrived in late autumn with 2 distinguished colleagues, their medical bags heavy with instruments Alexander had only read about. For a week, they subjected him to comprehensive evaluation, testing his reflexes, observing his daily routines, interviewing him about his symptoms and history. On the 3rd day, they witnessed a seizure. Alexander had dreaded this moment, but Dr. Morrison's clinical fascination held no judgment, only scientific curiosity. Ceres assisted with practiced ease, and when Alexander recovered, the doctor's respect for her knowledge was evident. The final evening, they gathered in the library for their verdict. Alexander's hands trembled as Dr. Morrison opened his leather notebook. "Your Grace, you have focal epilepsy, a manageable neurological condition. We found absolutely no evidence of mental incompetence. Your cognitive function is exceptional, your reasoning sound, your memory remarkable." Relief crashed over Alexander like a wave. "You're certain?" "Completely." Dr. Morrison leaned forward. "We're also certain you've been systematically poisoned with mercury. The pattern of symptom escalation correlates precisely with the household purchasing records Mrs. Thornhart discovered. Your uncle deliberately worsened your condition to make you appear mad. I've lost 20 years to a lie, Alexander whispered. Then make the next 20 count, Dr. Morrison said firmly. He turned to Ceres. You should have completed your training, Mrs. Thornhart. Your medical acumen is extraordinary. She smiled. Perhaps I still will. The doctors prepared exhaustive documentation for the hearing, agreeing to testify. The evidence was irrefutable, but Gerard's intelligence network reported that Richard's lawyer was still building a counter-case, gathering paid witnesses, preparing for battle. The medical dispensary opened in the East Wing on a crisp November morning. Ceres hired a nurse from the settlement, and together they offered free care to estate workers and their families. Alexander funded an education program for young women and shocked the territory by opening his vast library to the community. Knowledge shouldn't be hoarded, he told the first hesitant visitors. It should be shared. The boldest move came on Sunday. For the first time in 20 years, Duke Alexander Thornhart attended church services in Fargo Moorhead. The congregation's shock was palpable when he and Ceres entered, but Reverend Caldwell, a progressive minister, welcomed them warmly. The sermon, coincidentally, was about redemption and second chances. Alexander sat through the entire service without incident, and at its conclusion made a substantial donation to the church's charity fund. Townspeople watched, reassessing. He seemed composed, rational, generous, not mad at all. Margaret Cooper's world had collapsed. Her fiancé, discovered in financial scandal, had fled to California, leaving her with debts and a ruined reputation. Pride kept her from seeking help, but poverty was a cruel teacher. When Ceres heard of Margaret's circumstances, Alexander's response was immediate. Let her suffer. She's been nothing but cruel to you. She's desperate, Ceres said quietly. I remember that feeling. The offer of employment at the castle library arrived by courier. Margaret initially refused, pride still stinging, but when her landlord threatened eviction, she had no choice. She accepted, expecting humiliation, perhaps even gloating. Instead, Ceres treated her with professional respect. Genuine responsibilities, fair wages, courtesy in every interaction. Alexander was distant but civil. Their kindness confused Margaret more than cruelty would have. Slowly, working among the castle staff who adored their duke and duchess, her resentment began to crack. But danger was building. Richard Peacock, having lost everything, blamed the Thornharts for his ruin. His father awaited trial for murder. The family wealth was seized, his prospects destroyed. Gerard's network of servants reported alarming intelligence. Richard hiring rough men, drinking heavily in settlement taverns, speaking of making them pay. I should confront him, Alexander said, jaw tight. No, Ceres was firm. We prepare, but we don't provoke. They hired proper security former soldiers, trustworthy men who patrolled the grounds. Ceres never traveled without escort. Alexander's greatest fear, whispered in the darkness of their chamber, was losing her. But amid the tension, their relationship deepened. 4 months into marriage, they were still learning each other physically. Alexander's inexperience, both endearing and challenging, but their emotional intimacy was profound. Night conversations about dreams and fears, shared visions for the castle's future, genuine partnership in all things. Ceres's announcement shocked even Alexander. We're hosting a ball 2 months from now. A ball? Alexander's voice pitched higher. I can't manage a ballroom full of people. You don't have to manage them. Just be yourself. Her logic was infuriating in its simplicity. The hearing is 4 months away. Society needs to see you're competent, gracious, worthy of your title. Preparations consumed the castle. Over 100 invitations sent to territorial society, a chef hired from the capital, musicians engaged. The ballroom, unused for 25 years, was cleaned until it sparkled. Alexander had nightmares about seizing in front of everyone. Margaret, working in the library, observed the preparations with growing wonder. She watched how the lowest scullery maid received the same respect from the Duke as the head butler. How Ceres worked tirelessly for others, never seeking recognition. Her carefully cultivated resentment was crumbling. The night before the ball, Alexander found Ceres in the conservatory. The piano, now repaired, sang under her fingers a melancholy Chopin nocturne. What if tomorrow is a disaster? He asked. She didn't stop playing. Then we'll survive it. Together. He moved behind her, pulled her from the piano bench. "Dance with me. Now? I need practice." They waltzed through the conservatory, clumsy and unpracticed, but laughing genuine, unguarded joy. Tomorrow held uncertainties, but in this moment they had each other. Alexander stopped suddenly, breathless. "I love you." Ceres stilled in his arms. "Say that again." "I love you, Ceres Thornheart." She kissed him then, deep and certain. "I love you too, Alexander." Tomorrow would bring society's judgment, Richard's threats, the beginning of their final test. But tonight, in the conservatory where dead plants had once marked his isolation, love bloomed fierce and true. Tomorrow's uncertainties could wait. Dawn broke over Ravenscroft Castle to find it transformed into a hive of frantic activity. Servants polished silver until it gleamed, arranged flowers in every alcove, hung garlands along the grand staircase. The ballroom, dark for 25 years, blazed with hundreds of candles reflected in newly cleaned mirrors. Alexander had suffered a seizure that morning, stress-induced, predictable. Ceres found him in their chamber afterward, ashen and trembling. "Perhaps we should cancel," he said. "The doctors are here. Security is posted. We've done everything we can." She took his face in her hands. "You can do this." Gerard appeared in the doorway, eyes bright with emotion. "Your parents would be so proud, Your Grace." Carriages began arriving at dusk, a procession of territorial elite, curious to witness either triumph or disaster. The governor and his wife came, lending political weight to the event. Merchants who'd gossiped about the mad duke, landowners who'd questioned his competence, society ladies eager to dissect the scheming duchess, all gathered in the great hall, their whispers creating a steady hum of judgment. Then Alexander and Ceres appeared at the top of the grand staircase. Ceres wore emerald silk that caught the candlelight, her dark hair dressed with simple elegance. Alexander stood beside her in formal attire, his father's watch chain glinting at his waist. For a moment, silence fell absolute and heavy. They descended together, graceful and dignified, each step a declaration. The governor approached first, breaking the spell. "Your Grace, Duchess, thank you for the invitation. What a remarkable restoration you've accomplished." The ice broken, a receiving line formed. Alexander surprised himself by managing the social interaction, remembering names from correspondence, asking appropriate questions about harvests and families. Ceres remained at his side, supportive but never overshadowing, and guests found themselves impressed despite their prejudices. "He seems quite rational," came the whispered observations. "Perhaps we've misjudged." Margaret, hired to help coordinate the event, watched from the periphery. She saw how Ceres deflected cutting remarks with grace, how she elevated Alexander in every conversation, how genuine affection flowed between them. Something shifted in Margaret's heart, the last pieces of resentment crumbling. The orchestra began a waltz. All eyes turned to the Duke. Would he dance with his wife before this assembly of judges? Alexander extended his hand to Ceres. "May I?" They moved onto the ballroom floor, and for a few measures, they were alone in the world. Alexander was nervous, his steps occasionally uncertain, but he'd practiced, and love steadied him. The visible affection between them was undeniable. "Perhaps it's real after all," society ladies whispered, reassessing everything they'd assumed. An hour into the ball, Alexander felt the aura, that familiar metallic taste, the visual distortions that warned of an approaching seizure. "It's happening," he whispered to Ceres. She smoothly guided him toward a side room, but they didn't make it. In the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, Alexander Thornheart collapsed. Gasps of horror, ladies shrieking, men backing away, and underneath it all, the satisfied murmurs. "I knew he was mad." But Ceres dropped to her knees beside him, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. "He has epilepsy. This is a seizure, not madness. Please, give him space." Dr. Morrison pushed through the crowd, assisting as Ceres turned Alexander on his side, protected his head, monitored his breathing. Her medical expertise was on full display, calm, professional, competent. Within minutes, the seizure passed. Alexander came back to awareness slowly, groggy but conscious. He lay on the ballroom floor, every eye in territorial society watching him. This was the moment that would define everything: flee in shame or face them. "Whatever you want to do, I'm with you," Ceres whispered. Alexander let her help him stand. His legs shook, his head pounded, but he turned to face the assembled crowd. When he spoke, his voice was clear. "I have epilepsy. I'm not mad, not cursed. I'm simply a man with a medical condition." The silence stretched unbearably. Then the governor began applauding slow, deliberate claps that echoed through the ballroom. Dr. Morrison joined him. Slowly, others followed. Not everyone, but enough. The Duke had shown courage they hadn't expected, vulnerability that somehow commanded respect rather than pity. Remarkably, the ball continued. Guests stayed, now curious rather than judgmental. Alexander retired to rest, but Ceres remained, hosting with such grace and intelligence that society was forced to reassess. This woman was formidable, educated, compassionate, dignified. Not a schemer at all, but a partner worthy of a duke. Outside, however, danger approached. Richard Peacock and 6 hired thugs crept toward the castle. Their plan, desperate and violent, disrupt the ball, kidnap the Duchess, somehow force the Duke's incompetency. But Duke's security, former soldiers who took their duty seriously, intercepted them before they reached the entrance. The sheriff, an invited guest, was alerted immediately. Richard was brought to the Duke's study, hands bound, face flushed with drink and desperation. Alexander, still weak from his seizure, faced the son of the man who'd poisoned him for 15 years. "You've destroyed my family," Richard shouted. "Your father destroyed himself," Alexander said quietly, "and nearly destroyed me." Ceres entered then, assessing the situation with sharp eyes. Richard had expected vengeance, expected to be thrown into prison to rot beside his murdering father. Instead, she said something that shocked everyone in the room. "You have a choice, Richard. Prison for tonight's attempted assault, or—" She paused, letting the alternative sink in. "You work off your debt on our estate, learn honest labor, prove you can be better than your father made you." "Why would you help me?" Richard's voice cracked. "Because everyone deserves a chance to become better than their worst moment." The silence stretched as Richard wrestled with his pride. Finally, "I accept. I'll work for you." The sheriff witnessed the agreement, and Richard was escorted to the estate worker quarters, where he would begin rehabilitation at dawn. When Alexander and Ceres returned to the ballroom, the guests applauded. The final hour of the ball became a triumph. Alexander actually enjoyed himself, and when they danced again, he whispered, "We did it." "You did it," Ceres corrected. "You were magnificent." Guests departed with changed opinions. The governor predicted the hearing would be a formality. Society ladies offered begrudging respect. Even critics admitted the Duke had shown both competence and extraordinary courage. Alone in the disheveled ballroom, surrounded by wilting flowers and guttering candles, Alexander and Ceres held each other. "Thank you," he said, "for believing in me. Always." They swayed together in silence, no music needed, just each other. News of the ball spread through the territory with astonishing speed. Public opinion shifted like wind, changing direction. Perhaps the Duke wasn't mad after all. Perhaps the Duchess had shown remarkable grace under impossible circumstances. Richard's failed attack became known, and their mercy toward him impressed even the harshest critics. But the hearing still loomed 6 weeks away. The final test was approaching, and everyone knew it would determine not just the Duke's competency, but the future of everything they'd built together. 6 months after the storm that brought a desperate woman to his door, Duke Alexander Thornhart stood on the steps of the territorial capital courthouse. The building loomed before them, stone and authority, where his entire future would be decided. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Spectators filled every bench. Reporters clutched notebooks. Society ladies who'd attended the ball now came to witness the final judgment. Nicholas Peacock sat in chains, brought from prison where he awaited trial for murder. Beside him, his lawyer, expensive, cold-eyed, prepared to destroy everything Alexander had rebuilt. Richard Peacock sat in the back row, barely recognizable from the dissolute young man of 6 months ago. Clean, sober, weathered by honest labor. When their eyes met, Richard nodded with something that looked almost like respect. Nicholas's lawyer rose, his voice dripping with false concern. "Your Honor, we're here because Duke Alexander Thornhart suffers from epilepsy, a condition indicating hereditary madness. He's been manipulated by an opportunistic woman who saw a vulnerable, mentally incompetent man and seized her chance at wealth." Paid witnesses testified former servants who claimed the Duke was erratic, violent, unstable. Their lies were polished and rehearsed. The lawyer painted a picture of a cursed madman, unfit to hold title or make his own decisions. The marriage should be annulled, the estate placed in receivership. Alexander's hands clenched under the table. Ceres laid her hand over his, steady and warm. Their attorney from Chicago rose a formidable woman named Catherine Blake, who'd made her career defending the defenseless. "Your Honor, we will prove Duke Thornhart is not only competent, but has managed his estate with exceptional skill, while overcoming systematic poisoning and psychological abuse." Dr. Morrison took the stand first, his testimony methodical and damning. "I conducted a week-long evaluation of Duke Thornhart. His epilepsy is a manageable neurological condition, not mental illness. His cognitive function is exceptional. His business acumen is remarkable. The estate has prospered under his direct management." Medical evidence followed. Mercury poisoning documented through household accounts, Nicholas's control over the Duke's food, the deliberate worsening of seizures to create an appearance of madness. Castle staff testified through tears, explaining how they'd suspected something wrong but feared Nicholas's power. The sheriff described Nicholas's confession about the fire that killed Alexander's parents. Multiple witnesses had heard it. The investigation had been reopened. Evidence recovered. Murder, not accident. Nicholas's credibility collapsed like a house built on sand. Ceres took the stand with the grace of someone who'd found her purpose. She detailed her medical training, explained epilepsy in terms the courtroom could understand, described the development of her relationship with Alexander. "I married him because I love him," she said, meeting the lawyer's skeptical gaze without flinching. "His title and wealth were obstacles, not attractions. I wanted the man, not the fortune." Cross-examination tried to rattle her, suggesting impropriety, manipulation, greed. She deflected every attack with calm precision. The lawyer finally gave up, frustrated. Then Alexander took the stand, the most critical moment of the hearing. He was visibly nervous, but when he spoke, his voice was clear. The attorney asked about estate management, daily decisions, his relationship with Ceres. Alexander answered thoughtfully, articulately, providing specific examples of his competence. "Describe your uncle's influence on your life," the attorney prompted. "He convinced me I was cursed," Alexander said quietly. "For 20 years I believed isolation was the only safe choice. My wife showed me I was simply human, flawed perhaps, but worthy of love, connection, purpose." The opposition's cross-examination turned vicious, attempting to provoke a seizure through stress, asking intimate questions designed to shame him. But Alexander remained composed. "How can an epileptic possibly manage a vast estate?" the lawyer demanded. "The same way anyone manages anything," Alexander replied, "with dedication, intelligence, and support from those who love me." Then came a surprise. Margaret Cooper stood, asking to testify. The judge, intrigued, allowed it. She took the stand, nervous but determined. "Your Honor, I was one of those who mocked the Duchess. I called her a schemer, said cruel things about both of them." Her voice strengthened. "Then I lost everything and they offered me employment, not to humiliate me, but to help me. Working at the castle, I've witnessed their genuine love, their tireless work for others. They showed me mercy when I deserved none. That's not manipulation, that's nobility." Her testimony carried weight precisely because she'd been hostile initially. Finally, Richard Peacock approached the stand. The courtroom stirred the accuser's own son, testifying for the defense. "My father was corrupt," Richard said, each word clearly painful. "He murdered, stole, poisoned. He twisted me with his abuse and greed. When the Duke and Duchess could have destroyed me, they offered redemption instead." He looked directly at Alexander. "His Grace is the most competent, compassionate man I've ever known, and the Duchess is extraordinary." The contradiction of the accuser's own family testifying against him was devastating. Closing arguments were brief. The opposition had nothing left but outdated prejudices about epilepsy. The defense presented overwhelming evidence of competence, systematic fraud, and genuine love. The judge called a recess. 30 agonizing minutes passed. When he returned, the courtroom fell silent. "I've reviewed the evidence carefully," the judge said. "Duke Alexander Thornhart is clearly, unequivocally mentally competent. His epilepsy is a medical condition, not grounds for incompetency. The marriage to Duchess Ceres Thornhart is valid and legitimate. Nicholas Peacock's claims are dismissed entirely." He paused, looking at Nicholas with cold contempt. "Furthermore, Mr. Peacock's trial for murder is set for next month, and at the Duke's recommendation, Richard Peacock is granted probationary status to continue his rehabilitation." Applause erupted. The sheriff removed Nicholas, still protesting. Alexander and Ceres embraced, both crying with relief and joy. Gerard, watching from the gallery, wept openly. Society witnessed not scheming or manipulation, but genuine love triumphant. On the courthouse steps, a crowd had gathered. Alexander, emboldened by victory, addressed them spontaneously. "Thank you for giving me the chance to prove myself. Ravenscroft Castle will remain a permanent haven for anyone needing help, shelter, or a second chance." The crowd's response was warm, approving. Public opinion had shifted completely. The journey home felt different, lighter. "I'm free," Alexander said, staring out at the passing landscape. "Truly free." "We both are," Ceres replied, threading her fingers through his. 6 months later, the castle had fully transformed. The medical clinic operated daily, with Ceres now completing her formal medical training overseeing care. The education program served 30 young women. Workers fleeing abuse found refuge and dignity. Richard managed the Eastern estates with unexpected skill. Margaret ran an expanded library program, her bitterness replaced by purpose. The territory changed too. Other estates improved conditions, inspired by the Thornharts' example. Medical understanding of epilepsy spread. Women's education gained acceptance. Alexander appeared regularly in public now, an advocate for medical research and social reform. He still had seizures, but managed them openly, refusing to hide. He'd found purpose beyond mere survival. Ceres had become the territory's first female doctor, using her position to create systemic change, while remaining humble and service-focused. 1 year after the storm, they celebrated privately in the library where he'd first confessed his secret, where they'd first held hands. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd gone to the settlement instead?" Ceres asked. "Every day," Alexander admitted, "and every day I'm grateful you knocked on my door." Another storm. Autumn returned, bringing violent weather. At midnight, 3 desperate knocks echoed through the great hall. A young woman collapsed on the threshold, drenched, fleeing an abusive employer, nowhere else to turn. Duke and Duchess exchanged a knowing look. "Bring her inside," Alexander said without hesitation. The cycle of mercy continued. Later, they stood on the castle ramparts, watching the storm, holding each other. Territory lights twinkled below. The castle that had been a tomb now blazed as a beacon. "We're building something that will outlast us," Ceres observed. "No," Alexander corrected gently. "We've built something that will inspire others to build their own havens." The castle lights glowed through the storm, a symbol of hope, of transformation, of love that conquers isolation. And so the Duke, who was cursed to die alone, became the man who opened his heart, his home, and his fortune to an entire community. Ceres Nixon proved that true nobility isn't inherited, it's chosen, every single day, in how we treat those with less power than we do. If this story moved you, please subscribe and tell me in the comments, what walls have you built to protect yourself that might actually be keeping out the very thing you need most? Sometimes the greatest courage isn't facing the storm outside, it's opening the door to let someone in. Until our next tale, remember, you are never too broken, too old, or too cursed to find the love and acceptance you deserve. Thank you for walking these castle halls with me tonight.